So it's almost a prophetic kind of film in terms of where the West is going with this return to paganism and perhaps even human sacrifice. And it's a horrific worldview and situation, and it's not something we want to go back to, and yet here we are.
Come. It is time to keep your appointment with the Wicker Man.
We're later than the innkeeper's daughter's cycle for this one, folks. We're talking about Wicker Man. Wicker Man, the resurgence of paganism. Neo-paganism. I'm here with neo-pagan expert Jay Dyer.
When you and I started talking about social issues, philosophy, religion, all this kind of crazy, diet yoga culture that's out there, we started talking about a lot of these cults and the rise of paganism. And I think Burning Man is a perfect example of that. And Burning Man harkens to Wicker Man for sure. And the old one is a classic. A lot of people have forgotten this movie.
This movie was really good, man. Christopher Lee is in it. It's probably one of his better roles. I think he really liked this film a lot. I think he was real proud of it.
I realized that it was in its own way a masterpiece. It's the best picture that I've ever been in.
It's very non-stereotypically Hollywood. It doesn't lionize neo-paganism. It doesn't exalt it. And it doesn't denigrate the Christian character in the film.
So the reason it's not Hollywood is a British film. A lot of British films tend to have a little more slower plot development. They're more focused on ideas, not so much the boobs and explosions, like Hollywood typically is. So
there's a lot of boobs in Wicker Man, though. The one critique is there's a little bit of some boobage.
At least in the ORGY scene, they kind of like had people clothed and
it wasn't super graphic. It's not hyper. It's not really graphic. But it's the sexuality is an underlying weaponized aspect of the neo-pagan culture within.
That's the thing is that when he gets to the island, it's a return to full-on sexual degeneracy. Basically, it still kind of has a loose Christian theme. It doesn't have the notion of us coming away thinking that Lord Summerisle and the people on this island are the way we should go. I think we come away with thinking that it's a horrific worldview and situation, and it's not something we want to go back to. And yet here we are in the modern world, literally going back to this worldview with the rise of paganism. And you could include the New Age stuff because it overlaps, right? Like the pagan stuff and the New Age stuff overlap at Burning Man, which has this giant burning effigy of a man, which is a traditional Celtic druidic practice related to human sacrifice. The first one at least has this Christian-ish theme where the guy sees himself as a martyr. They call him a martyr. He's actually dying because he was faithful to his confession. And we don't get any ideas that, this is so much of a superior situation than...
Right. It's almost the opposite, right? He is an actual virtuous character who goes to the island of Summerisle. He's looking for a missing girl. A lot of the inhabitants of the Scottish island, who their accents are great, right? It seems like they actually cast kind of local actors here. The costumes are really good in the original. Even the clothes look worn. One of the most annoying things with Hollywood films is you'll have everybody's clothing looks completely spotless and brand new. Nick Cage in the remake, he's a cop and he's got his leather jacket and it's just all shiny and new. There's nothing has ever been worn that the characters are wearing. But even like the costumes, the set design, and the actors that were chosen, they got a lot of people with gnarled faces, and they're these old, kind of not really overtly creepy looking people. They just kind of look like down home old Scottish folk, and they receive him with a lot of suspicion. They're very suspicious of outsiders. They're not so sure about this guy, and they're really evasive. He's asking them, well, where is Rowan? There's a missing girl on the island. Which the one critique of the plot would be that who snitched on the missing girl. But we realize later on.
Yeah, we realize later
why he would be sent there, because it doesn't make sense as you're watching it. We're like, why would somebody, if this island seems so tightly knit and it's such an insulated community that are completely wrapped up in these old pagan practices and the old ways and worshiping the old gods? Well, who snitched? Who's snitching on the missing girl? Well, you find out later on at the end of the film, after his journey of discovery, he goes through this labyrinth of learning about their neo-pagan practices, which are depraved and a little bit degenerate, very much based on fertility rituals, seeming phallus worship, the May Day dancing around the maypole, and all of these practices that they are engaged in. And their crops have failed, and their sacrifices have failed, so they need a human sacrifice. He believes the human sacrifice is going to be a little girl, but we end up finding that there's a different plan a little later on. Main character, it's so rare to have a legitimately Christian character in any film that comes out of Hollywood. You mentioned it's a British film. It starts out with them praying. I think they're praying something from a psalm, and I think he's some sort of a reader or something in the Anglican Church. He's reading from one of the epistles of St. Paul, and it actually shows him taking communion, and he's established to be a virtuous virgin character. He's a virgin male who's engaged to be married and is very serious about his faith, which is consistently tested through the film of them trying to incite him into lust and get him to join their kind of reproductive rituals, which seems like their whole island is all about.
You know, we see him taking the Eucharist, which is a form of sacrifice, and we are being kind of given a foreshadowing of the fact that he's going to be the sacrifice. And what's interesting is that he is sort of completely oblivious to all of the symbols and imagery that confront him that he should have noticed. So I don't think he's a malicious character, but he's kind of a fool character.
He's a bit naive. Yeah.
He's the fool king, and he becomes the sacrifice.
Well, they literally dress him up as a fool. Well, they ritualistically set him up to willingly become the fool, play the part of the fool in that sacrifice.
Yeah, and so when he gets to the island, he should have noticed, well, why do the boats have the, superstitious eye painted on the front of the boat?
Yeah.
When he gets to the inn, it's the Green Man Inn. And the Green Man is a, traditional pagan image of nature or Pan or something like that. So the worship of the Green Man is an ancient English Druidic thing. And so he's not really paying attention to all these signs. And he also doesn't realize or notice that he does a little bit later on, but there's nothing Christian on the island at all. In fact, the church is in ruins.
Yeah.
So there's no church. And, in the so-called Christendom of England and the UK, he should have noticed that, why do we not have a functioning church and minister here of any kind? And he begins to suspect, well, it looks like they do have some kind of religion, but they've left Christianity at some point in the distant past, presumably a long time ago, because the church looks like it's been in ruins for a century or two. And they return to the traditions of their fathers, the pagan traditions. But I think he still can't fathom the possibility that they would have returned to something like human sacrifice.
Yeah, the obliviousness of the character, and it ends up leading to his downfall. His virtue, I guess that would be maybe a somewhat subversive element. I'm not sure how intentional that is, but his virtues do lead to his demise. But from the Christian perspective, of course, his demise is a true martyrdom, right? It's portrayed as actual martyrdom, which is not something I've ever really seen in a film that came out of the Hollywood system. Again, this is a British film, so it does make sense that they were allowed a little bit more leeway.
There might even be an element to where they want him to be innocent. They don't want him to,
of course,
know. So they kind of throw this stuff in his face to psyop him, to gaslight him, to mess with him. But they also don't want him figuring it out because they want a sacrifice. And so there seems to be this kind of pagan revelation of the method notion idea going on where the more that he buys into it, the more they would reason he's a willing sacrifice. And so he's complicit essentially in this. And in a way, he's innocent. He's the fool king. He doesn't do anything necessarily wrong or malicious. But his naivety becomes the basis for which he is, in the mind of the pagans, a complicit and perfectly innocent sacrifice. Because you want to sacrifice, like Christ as the Passover lamb. He's the innocent Passover lamb. So he doesn't know evil. And they actually use that argumentation against him at the end when they're like, why wouldn't you want to be martyred and seated with your God, right? We don't have that God, but we're giving you the very thing that in your worldview you think is like the highest honor to be a martyr. So the first thing we notice, there's nothing Christian going on here at all. He immediately sees signs of just already paganism and generative principle worship. Yeah, worshiping the phallus, the ORGY as he stumbles out of the pub. And he noticed that, they have no compassion for him. And so there's no hospitality. There's no recognition of his authority. He represents man's law, or a foreign Christendom law, the Queen's law, the King's law. I'm saying that the Queen is Christian, but you know what I mean. Like
right. Well, it's the old ways, right? From the British perspective, the King, the Queen, and the monarchy at that time still had a certain level of respect, which was more than it is now. The church had more influence than it does now. It was still, generationally degraded. the Church of England, it started out on terrible footing. So, yeah, no, you're absolutely right there.
Yeah, it hadn't degraded to the point that it has now.
Let us greet our newly installed Archbishop.
In the film, it represents that. And so we start noticing that a lot of the elements within the presentations of the village to him represent him.
Yeah.
Right. He's going to be represented by the rabbit. He's going to be represented as
the hare. Excuse me, it's not a rabbit. It's not a silly rabbit. They specifically say this. It's not a rabbit, it's the hare.
The first thing that occurs is the temptation. And I think that the purpose of that is to, again, make sure it's almost like the pagans think that if they can corrupt him, he won't be a sacrifice. So the more that he keeps his virtue, the more fattened he becomes.
Yeah, it's like it charges them up. They seem to become more and more excited about him, almost as if they've been through this type of situation before, which clearly, this is supposed to be.
In the past they have, yeah. Mm-hmm. And also they've left science, obviously, because they believe that the source of the island's curse is the gods. It's nature. So that's why he's tempted first with that, right? Willow sings this song and bops a tambourine naked in a room, and he hears her singing. I don't know why this particularly turns him on so much, right? I guess he just feels like she's beckoning me, like she's thirsty. She's dancing around singing this goofy song. That's a test for him. He passes his test, and so they're like, oh yeah, this dude's going to be a right sacrifice. Christopher Lee is perfect as.
Oh, he's so good.
I don't understand why he has a Karen haircut. They gave him an ant.
Only thing that's wrong. Yeah, they should have given him either long hair.
Yeah, exactly.
They should have just given him full long hair. He's got this Anglo Jufro type thing going on.
It looks like somebody's aunt, dude. It's like a Karen.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I don't know. It's just contextual. It's 1976. At the time, that haircut meant something different. One of the first exposures we have to him is he's talking about the return to the old gods. He says something about wanting to be like the animals. What does he say? I think I could turn and live with animals. He gives this kind of whole neo-pagan return speech. He says, they do not make me sick discussing their duty to God. Very well written. I think it's one of the better written horror type films. It brings up the ideas of kind of anarchism, the hatred of hierarchy, the spite that he has for the church, the spite that he has for Christ. And
yeah, exactly.
This is said while it's kind of cut in between. His little speech here is cut in between Sergeant Neil kneeling and praying. So Sergeant Neil, whose name kind of, is an
Kneels.
He kneels. So he's kneeling and praying. He's shown kneeling and praying several times throughout the film. And that's juxtaposed with Christopher Lee's speech of, return to the old ways.
The next thing that I think stands out is when he starts interviewing people across the island, and he notices them not celebrating any Christian festivals, but rather the maypole. If you notice, when the children are dancing around the maypole and singing it, they start shaking the ribbons. And it actually, if you notice, it looks like sperm impregnating. There's the pole, of course, is a phallic thing. And then you have these very spermy, I'm being serious. It looks like sperm.
No, you're right. Normally you would project sort of these type of things, of course, but in this case, you're correct.
Well, and they're singing the song about there once was a man, and a man on a woman on a seed, and a seed on a tree.
Yes.
They're singing a song about the seed, the sperm, and the generative principle, and how the maypole is just really symbol of nature worship, and nature worship is the essence of it is the generative sexual, coitus. And then he goes to the school, and the children are all learning witch stuff. They're learning root working. Right.
And the teacher asks them what the maypole represents, and they say, it's a phallic symbol. And this is when the character walks in, and he's hearing the teacher teaching them about phallic symbols, and the maypole is a phallic symbol, and we dance around the maypole. And he's like, what?
Degeneracy? What is this degeneracy?
Yeah, he says that he's a total right-wing extremist, white man. and drops this right-wing extremism on them. He calls them degenerates.
Then he walks out and interviews some more people, and he finds the ruins of the church and a grave. And he says, where's the Christian graveyard and the chapel? And they're like, oh, yeah, we don't believe in that anymore. We believe in reincarnation. So we're back to, again, classic pagan cycle of nature. Reincarnation is part of that cyclical pagan view. There's no crosses. And he makes the cross in the cemetery, right? Then he goes to the doctor's room and he notices like a jar of foreskins, a jar of snake oil, and a bunch of pickled punks. And then he sees the maidens doing like a naked fire dance or something, jumping over the fire. And so, again, it's like every single possible sign of, dude, there's a bunch of pagans. Right? You haven't figured this out yet, right? And he just, again, totally oblivious to it. Parthenogenesis, reproduction without sexual union. And so this is a bizarre sort of superstitious practice that they're engaging in. This is the leaping over the fire thing. And so it's like they're having their version of the virgin birth. And doesn't Christopher Lee say something about like, how do you believe in the virgin birth? It's just as superstitious, you say. And they're doing their version of it. And he basically is arguing that, the Christian God is dead on this island. Like, we're done with that. We don't, that's gone. Christopher Lee's grandfather in 1868, he says, had founded this island as a way to get away from what they saw as corrupt, decadent Christendom and Christian civilization.
I feel like you could give a lot of insight into this character, right? I mean, he's never shown. You see some old paintings of him, but yeah, Lord Summerisle. He says his grandfather bought the island in 1868. He makes this claim: the old gods are not dead. And then the other character says, well, what of the true God? And he says, he's dead. He had his chance. He blew it.
Yeah.
So then he goes on to kind of explain Lord Summerisle's grandfather. He was a distinguished Victorian scientist, an agronomist, and a free thinker, right? So he's kind of this Enlightenment character, Victorian scientist, but at the same time, he's a free thinker. Right, so he's obsessed with this, return to occultism, which is interesting, and you've talked about this a lot about John Dee, the roots of modern scientism being alchemy.
Well, there was this weird bubbling undercurrent during the Victorian time, which was there was a lot of Calvinism and a lot of Puritanism in England, Victorian England, and in the Anglican Church at that time. So while that was like the most probably puritanical, sexually speaking and ethically speaking, in England, you also have this undercurrent of a rebellion and a swelling up against that, which you had a lot of secret societies. This is where you get the rise of mesmerism, seances, all this stuff starts getting really, really popular. And I think that's because there had always kind of been a pagan undercurrent. It was just kind of on the down low, right? So during the periods when England had these laws against witchcraft and against sorcery and against buggery, which I'm sure you know what that is. These are all laws on the books that, were probably in many cases enforced even up into the 1940s and 50s, because they went after Alan Turing for being PEDO even up into the time World War II, because he was cracking the codes of the tiny mustache man, but he was also like PEDO and buggery. Buggery laws got him even that late. So this is pretty serious stuff in Victorian England. So I think that you have this guy who supposedly is a scientist, but not really. It sounds like he probably also was interested in paganism. And so the idea that, Darwinism, Enlightenment, atheism would somehow give man fulfillment is ironically shown to be false in this character who is supposed to be a scientist, but actually ends up, we can presume, founding this pagan commune on an island in the 1860s. So really, he's just way ahead of his time, right? Like he's a biohacking communal bro, 100 years before everybody else. Yeah. And so he had the idea to, just return to the old ways. And that, I think, is in line with a lot of these characters. Dame Frances Yates has a classic book on this. She was, I think, the British scholar who wrote on the Enlightenment as actually a pagan movement, and that under the Enlightenment's public face of scientism and materialism, you had all these alchemical, esoteric, secret society movements, particularly the Rosicrucians. It's called the Rosicrucian Enlightenment by Dame Frances Yates. Yeah. So it starts with covering John Dee, and then it moves into covering Frederick the Elector, Palatine. There's this undercurrent in the lodges, right, of Freemasonry, people interested in alchemy, people interested in Hermeticism. You mentioned earlier Shakespeare. There's quite a bit of evidence that Shakespeare was very much into alchemy. And so a lot of the texts of Shakespeare literally used a lot of esoteric alchemical themes, maybe even Rosicrucian ideas. And I had some pretty lengthy classes or grad classes on Elizabethan alchemical literature. So this is an area I know quite a bit about. There's the poems of this time are crazy, right? This is what prepares for the Victorian period.
The Masons even tried to claim Shakespeare as right. You know, they actually, if you read Manly P. Hall's Secret Teachings of All Ages, there's this funny page where it shows Sir Francis Bacon, and then there's a transparent page right before it, and that's it. He basically shows that the paintings of the bust of Shakespeare and Francis Bacon are identical. So the Masons claim that Francis Bacon was Shakespeare, in fact, and that all of his works were actually the works of Masonry. It's unclear whether they love to make these claims. They also make these claims. Jesus was a Mason. Everybody was a Mason.
Everybody was secretly a Mason. That book's kind of ridiculous because he claims that there's a secret council of Masons behind every event in world history.
Yeah, for thousands of years.
Yeah, exactly.
But the lodge literally goes back to Pythagoras, right? Pythagoras was a Freemason, but I think they co-opt these ideas and they claim ancient roots, and they're just constantly recreating what they assume was going on, and they mythologize themselves.
Yeah, another example of this is Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen, which was originally intended to be the Elizabethan, it was what Virgil's Aeneid was to Rome, the official myth of the empire. It was going to be that to the British Empire. It was so dense and esoteric that most people couldn't really vibe with it. But it's very famous as a really super esoteric piece of literature, and it's full of what we're talking about, right? I mean, it's reincarnation, it's Hermeticism, it's all the things that you think of. So this was super, super popular from the time of Elizabeth up until the time that we're talking about. I think that undergirds the idea that this grandfather character was in those circles, maybe even the Royal Society circles.
Exactly.
And then he decides to go off and kind of start his own, religious commune.
Yeah, almost like an experiment, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. And beyond that, we even get these really weird hybridizations, which reminds me of the great chapter in Russian is one of the many where he covers the ancient rituals of chaos. And the Greeks had this ritual where they would reenact primordial chaos. And it included every form of degeneracy you could think of. So, for example, the men would dress up like women. The women would dress up like men. They would put on beards.
What a novel idea. Where have we ever seen any of these ideas?
That's what I'm saying.
Oh, my goodness.
And these are Bacchanalia type services and rituals. Yeah. And so you'll notice in the movie, they have a man woman, a man animal, a man fool. Christopher Lee eventually puts on a half man, half woman outfit. He looks like a woman.
Yep.
And he's supposed to be the hermaphrodite. And that's because this ritual is the blending of all things back to primordial chaos to, in their pagan mind, restart the cycle. So it's a cyclical view. It's restarting the cycle. And Christopher Lee embodies that. As Jamie and I were watching it this last time, I was like, these pagans are at least not going into full on hermaphrodite, trans mode. And then there they are. They do.
Yeah, they totally do. They fully do. Yeah, then they say that we don't believe in death like you believe in death. You die, you become a part of the trees, you become part of the soil, you become a part of the air. You're everywhere. So it's kind of this almost monistic idea.
Absolutely. It's also a king kill ritual. Are you familiar with that?
Yes. Yeah. The murder of the king ritual. Exactly.
The ancient English British Isles traditions of John Barleycorn and bringing the bread man out and all of these rites, which in a lot of the British villages and countryside and islands, that never went away. So even though Anglican Christianity and Catholicism and Orthodoxy prior to that had reached the UK, a lot of the villagers still kept these traditional folk ceremonies. But the folk ceremonies of the English Isles were kind of the inheritance of these Celtic Druidic services, which do have the human sacrifice component. And that's what this is all about, right? So we even see not just the John Barleycorn human-sized bread, which represents that we're going to feed on the human sacrifice. But the hand of glory, which I didn't expect to see in this, because I thought that was more of like a voodoo thing, where, you know what I'm talking about, the hand of glory.
Yeah, they do it to put him to sleep, right? They put the so-called hand of glory in there to. It's a severed human hand, and they put candles on it or something.
Put candles and certain markings on it, and it has its own whole history behind that whole thing. The sword chop dance scene is interesting. I'm not exactly sure what to make of that, and maybe they were just mixing together a lot of.
Well, it seems like they had a lot of historically accurate practices that they really distilled into this culture. So maybe not all these things were going on in the, the Scottish Hebrides Isles, but they're taking things from all over different Celtic cultural hotspots and kind of amalgamating them into these practices here.
But it seems like the point was that they wanted a chaste virgin Christian male sacrifice. And that's interesting because Crowley says in one of his famous texts, something like a male virgin, he says kid.
A pure male virgin child.
Which they say is, it's just a goat, right? So there might be that kind of Crowleyan element here as well. And then they have this argument between him and Christopher Lee about, well, you came of your own free will to this appointed place of your fate, because they believe in the fates as pagans and not in divine providence. And sort of try to argue him into saying that, why wouldn't you accept being the human sacrifice if you believe your religion? Because we'll make you a martyr. You'll get to sit with your God in your heavenly throne or whatever. Yeah. And then you can do us the favor of getting rid of the curse on our crops, right? So it's a really interesting exchange towards the end. And of course, he accepts that martyr's death. But it's almost a prophetic kind of film in terms of where the West is going with this return to paganism and perhaps even human sacrifice. And then you get these manifestations of Burning Man and this kind of stuff, like it's so cool, dude, like the pig. It's like, why would you think that rolling around in dung and dressing up, and by the way, the Saturnalian, Bacchanalian, I mean, that even included like bestiality stuff, right? So I'm not trying to get too gross, but I mean, it was like every form of inversion and blending of opposites. It was transgressing of all limitations and boundaries to restart primordial chaos. Okay, so this is just madness. Why would we want to return to this kind of a civilization destroying worldview when it's not going to be good for anybody? And it's actually a tool of the elite. I think we even get that theme in this movie, right? I mean,
exactly. Well, with this being a tool of the elite, I mean, this kind of royal society.
He's like a Scottish lord. He's like a lord nobility.
Lord Summerisle, whose grandfather was an occultic, Masonic, Victorian scientist and occultist who was a free thinker. I mean, the term free thinker specifically used there indicates a really specific milieu in the culture in Victorian England at the time, who were, dabbling in all sorts of strange practices.
And you'll notice he doesn't live in harmony with nature. He lives in a giant estate.
You and I did Midsommar, and that movie was essentially a remake of this. Midsommar is stylistically a better remake than the actual remake of Wicker Man. As far as the substance of the film, it's weaponized pop culture. The character whose name is Christian in Midsommar ends up being sacrificed in the May Day ritual and led along this kind of breadcrumb trail into this horrific sacrifice scene it's very frightening, right? Midsommar in a lot of ways is more scary than Wicker Man. Wicker Man has a sense of humor. It's creepy, but it's not a movie that's going to give you nightmares or anything like that. Whereas Midsommar was a really subversive film about the denigration of Christianity, the destruction of manhood, and the sacrifice of the naively virtuous Christian male character at the altar of paganism to bring back this kind of new, almost like a new aeon of going back to the ancestors and the old gods. Whereas Wicker Man, it almost seems like a blatant critique on paganism. To me, it doesn't seem like the neo-pagan movement looks really good at the end of Wicker Man, and the Christian character is very virtuous.
So yeah, I think you're right to say that Midsommar is kind of a critiquing of Christian morals.
It almost seems like the point of it is just to destroy your psyche. It almost seems like it's just an onslaught of the psyche.
Yeah, well, and that's the guy that made Hereditary, and that was like a straight up, ritual magic horror movie that I've done a few videos on.
But can you think of any other movies where there's like a real virtuous Christian character that's not made out to be a fool or a buffoon?
Yeah, I think you'd have to go back to pre-60s countercultural revolution Hollywood to find that kind of stuff. Because, prior to that time, Hollywood, even into the 60s, was still making Christian-themed films. And so there were a lot of blockbusters and kind of big, Bible-type movies, even into the 1960s. And then after the 60s countercultural revolution, you get, particularly after Rosemary's Baby, this pretty much paradigm shift, I would say, in the themes and attitudes that Hollywood projects. And so even though this isn't Hollywood, the 70s, after the 60s cultural revolution, you start to get the rise of things like Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin actually popularized the Lord of the Rings again, turned into a new phenomenon. So people were getting into the old ways, the old ideas. I'm not saying that Lord of the Rings is necessarily pagan, but there was this idea that we could return to the land and we don't have to be necessarily weird New Agers. We can be the straight up pagans. And so there's this revival of paganism after the 1960s. Not every people are maybe discouraged by the hippie movement. And so they start looking for other avenues, a lot of boomers. And this is where I think we get the rise of the neo-pagan stuff, the rise of paganism. The Pentagon was putting out stuff at this time talking about the Archaic revival, talking about similar to SRI documents that you covered the other day, Changing Images of Man. They were also studying primitivism. It's called the Archaic revival. Yeah. And the idea of returning to the land.
And just throwing this out there, we've talked about Terence McKenna. Terence McKenna, really connected to the Esalen Institute, yeah, which was getting tons of institutional funding, even government funding. And McKenna really helped to bring about the popularity of this Archaic revival thing. And then he connected this to the rave scene in the 90s, which was kind of the afterbirth of the Cultural Revolution of the 60s.
Yeah, this is one of those kind of like offshoots, right, of the rise of the New Age in the 60s counterculture. You get this offshoot of people going into the domain of being interested in outright paganism and ritual magic, right? I'm not saying Lord of the Rings is that, but it's grouped with that via Led Zeppelin.
That's an interesting point. I'm really glad you brought that up, because I actually wrote down Led Zeppelin 3 just in my notes while watching Wicker Man, because the music in Wicker Man, the music's really well done. It's kind of a folky rock acoustic guitar style music, and you can tell it's really influenced by that record. And that record, which was, it's a really good rock record I think it's Led Zeppelin's best album. I'm not a huge Led Zeppelin fan anymore, but that record was really solid. With all, it had a Tangerine.
Yeah, I used to have I was a big Led Zeppelin fan back in my teens and 20s. And I think everybody has those phases where you get really into classic rock, when you're younger or whatever.
This film seems to really tie in with that aesthetic of, acoustic, folky music. And although this is a critique of this countercultural movement that was happening at about the same time, this is kind of right after the seemingly failed cultural revolution that seemed to crescendo and peak with Altamont and Woodstock. Altamont and Woodstock kind of being these huge, throwback pagan festivals, essentially, right? Exactly. I mean, at Woodstock, Ravi Shankar was there, so there was this idea of, infusing the culture with the Eastern practices, yoga, Hinduism, and then at the same time, you've got other characters like, Hendrix was kind of this godlike character to so many people at the time, and when you look at what Woodstock ended up being, I mean, it was a giant human social experiment, and it was a really disgusting thing. I mean, just almost 500,000 people.
Everybody's just caked in mud, stinking like underarms and butt. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't look like a lot of fun. But,
rolling in mud like pigs, acting like animals. Yeah, we're
gonna fight the man. Like, there's a legitimate concern with the
Vietnam War and all that stuff. Right?
Yeah, like the lies that were being perpetuated for the military-industrial complex. But then what happened was, as many people theorize, the way to neutralize that real opposition was to steer it over into hedonism.
Yes.
That's exactly what happened through a lot of these movements.
Jim Morrison, I think he's the most emblematic character of this whole thing. I don't know what his real intentions were. He seemed like a really tortured, lost soul type character. Whether he was a blatant tool and knew what he was doing. His father was Admiral Stephen Morrison, who was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It is debatable on what level of knowledge Admiral Stephen Morrison had, regardless of, his knowledge of being involved in these, Psyop type things. Jim Morrison was an instrumental character in a kind of bringing back the idea of bacchanalia. He was obsessed with Pan. He was really into the other god of wine, Dionysius. He almost saw himself as like the incarnation of Dionysius, and he had visions of, satyrs and these old gods prancing around. That's my favorite Oliver Stone film. It was actually The Doors movie. I think that's one of his better ones. That and JFK. But yeah, Morrison was real instrumental in bringing this stuff about as well. Called himself the Lizard King. He, chanted these kind of mantras and really infused that psychedelic, hypersexualized and really strangely dream-like Jungian visual lyrical style with this call back to paganism and then the rock star worship thing too. So all this stuff, this film is right after all these characters had already peaked, and a lot of them died, at their own hands or at because of drug overdoses or, their hedonism led them to their death. Yep. So that's, these characters in the countercultural movement are almost like Wicker Men. They're almost like willing Wicker Men that really represented the American male, the formerly white Christian male. Who becomes given over to the excesses of the revolution and just basically offs himself ritualistically publicly.
Yeah, I think the commonality here is that when we turn away from God, the first thing that we begin to worship is nature. And, nature, the generative principle, which is kind of the most, evident thing that we notice in nature. There's death and there's rebirth. There's the seed, there's the womb, and then we have rebirth. This is typically the cycle of nature. This is the Ouroboros that we see pictured in a lot of ancient mysteries. It actually comes up in the Nicolas Cage one if you were looking.
Well, what's interesting? I'm looking here. I've got this article pulled up from Cine Fantastique, and it's an old article from 1977. Christopher Lee. He says, the power of the unseen. There are communities today that are not what they seem. Look at Freemasonry. Although I'm neither condemning it nor comparing it to a pagan religion, but it's a secret society in a benevolent sense with a highly organized set of beliefs and practices. It has considerable power, at least to its members. The Wicker Man is not an attack on contemporary religion, but a comment on it, its strengths as well as its weaknesses, its fallibility, that it can be puritanical and won't always come out on top. Even the Christian religion is based on the execution and sacrifice of one man, it says. In that respect, there's no difference at all. Christ was sacrificed to appease the organized establishment and was condemned as a criminal, which is not the case with Howie. If anything, it was the establishment that Schaeffer attacked in his script. Summerisle embodies the pagan beliefs. He's responsible, the third generation of the founding of it, for its being on the island. Part of the mysterious effect of the film is bound up with this fact and of the various scenes and descriptions of pagan ritual and actually taking place that actually take place in the film. So one of the most interesting parts of it is the establishment who set this island up. It is the lords that set this up and is a multi-generation effect of their worldview. They want to bring back the old gods while pretending this is some sort of a new idea, right? So it's progress. This is enlightenment. This is the result of man's forward motion towards his development, his evolution, and the new gods, right, are the old gods. Neo-paganism isn't really a return. It is a resurgence of a lot of the same ideas, similar forms, similar ideas, but done in a new way. It's disconnected, right? So you see like the guys trying to recreate Odinism and go back to what they think is their Viking roots, right? They're completely disconnected from their so-called Viking roots, their ancestors. So they'll exalt their ancestors. They'll talk about how great the ways of the ancestors are, but at the same time, they have no idea what the ancestors were doing, where their practices even came from. And they're basically worshiping like Marvel superhero characters to a certain extent. There was a post on Twitter recently of this neo-pagan's kind of prayer corner, and it was super goofy. He had a bowl of milk so that Thor could drink that milk. He had these like Amazon.com purchased statues of Thor. It looked just like a Christian icon corner, except adapted to, this like modern idea of return. We got to return to the old ways. these people think they're connecting to their ancestors, but they're really just, it's a recreationist thing. They're not
It's a
really,
made-up thing. There is no ancient
Disney.
tradition that you link into. In fact, one thing that's funny about this tradition of like Wotan and Odin and all that stuff is, like, you know, they'll say, oh, Christianity is a stupid religion. It's a borrowed from a bunch of other religions. And then you're like, well, you know, didn't Odin die on a tree?
right.
I mean, you make fun of your God died. It's like, yeah, but Odin dies on a tree. So wait a minute. Oops. Right. So it's very arbitrary in what they pick and choose in terms of like commonalities amongst religions. And part of their religion has this ridiculous story of like people fighting over a weave. I'm dead serious. There's a squirrel that like fights with Odin or one of the gods.
Like a nappy ass weave?
I'm serious. A nappy ass weave.
Squirrel's like, you better give me that nappy ass weave. The other squirrel's
It's
like,
a little squirrel being like, give me that weave. Nata Tosker, which is the old Norse for squirrel, runs up and down. Listen, he runs up and down the world tree of Yggdrasil to carry the messages between the eagles perched at the top and the serpent at the bottom. And then he gets into a fight over hair that has been woven, a weave, between him and another guy. so like anytime they try to play the RACE card, if you're a neo-pagan, be like, dude, your gods fight over weaves. What are you talking about?
I mean, you haven't seen the weave though, to be fair. Like, you don't
Exactly.
You don't know how great that weave was.
Well, I mean, this dude right here, like, he's going to have a pretty sweet weave by the end of the day.
Dang, right? Dude. Christianity debunked. They should remake an African version of Wicker Man, Wakanda Wicker Man.
No. We know what it should obviously be. Wicker
Man.
Exactly.
It's Black Panther can end up getting the weave and putting it on his chick, and then she will get powers. Not the weave. Not the weave. Yeah. That's
genius.
That's gonna be the last line.